Magotra, who is the Deputy Director um, and founder member, of Integrated Research for Action and Development, and the founder member for South Asia Heat Health Network. They all are very overachieving individuals with long bios that I'm not going to read, but they're all in your folders, and they're all very easily Googleable people as well, and maybe through ChatGPT nowadays, you don't know what all is possible. But what they all have in common, interestingly, is that they have perspectives from on ground at various levels, but also understand these ideas at the policy-making level, right, on integrating the very topic, right, gender with climate action. And what we are hoping to do through this panel is to learn about some of the examples of how this can actually be done. So moving from, of course, we know that this needs to be done, but what are the methods in which this can be achieved, and what must we be thinking about going forward? So I'm actually going to start with Aditi. And Aditi has worked on the field to integrate some of those perspectives at city, state, and national levels. But she has also interestingly worked on two state-level gender-responsive state action plans of Uttarakhand and MP. And Aditi, if you could share with us some of your learnings from that work and that research.
Thank you, and let me begin by thanking Kubernein and WISCOMP and India International Center for having me here, also for having a very interesting set of speakers. And so I was supposed to leave at noon, but I've actually delayed it so I can hear all of you and participate in the discussion before I leave. So I'm just going to take like a short time, and then I guess we'll have more question answers, right?
Yes, ideally, I have one question for each of you all, and we could do another
5
round.
minutes?
Yes,
or?
definitely.
Okay. So the first question that I'd really like to ask here is that where are the men? It's so skewed, the participation, and yes. You're an old hand at it. Right. So I think that kind of, shows that gender is nowhere on really the climate change agenda. And the other thing that I'd like to really say is that, I agree that urban has not been discussed on climate change, and it's not that we've not spoken about gender justice at the UN. We've been speaking about gender justice for a very, very long time at the UN, but somehow that process has never really come together with the climate change process, or even with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's what really, really surprised me. Because we have the CEDAW, the Bill of Rights for Women, which all countries have ratified with some reservations. But that process for CEDAW to recognize that gender is so important in climate change took forever, and they're still struggling with it, which is so surprising. So, when we talk in India that, nobody's talking about women and climate change, look at the global platforms. So, yes, I think numbers do count. Yes, you cannot just, add and stir and just say that, so many number of women do not make a difference. They do make a difference. I think they do make a difference. So I think definitely on global platforms, we need to have at least 50% women. They may not be feminists, they may not be gender sensitive, but some of the men can be more gender sensitive, some of the men can be more feminist, but just having women in the room forces you to think differently. At least somebody will say, but listen, this doesn't work with us, This doesn't work with that woman on the ground. So I think definitely numbers is something that we need to have. Now, of course, the UNFCCC has spoken about numbers, but too late, too little. But I think my main concern has been that the UN processes on gender equality, gender justice have not informed the climate justice processes. I mean, climate justice or climate change processes. The panel on climate change has been extremely influenced by the US scientists, by Eurocentric scientists, uh, but the actual impacts are taking place in developed countries, in developing countries. And there are hardly very few male scientists, hardly any women scientists from these countries. So, I mean, it's a very, very big challenge. It's a very big challenge. Why? Because the whole Paris negotiation is based on the IPCC reports, right? They are the ones who inform the policymakers. So obviously, we have to really start digging deep and see where is it that we need to bring about that change. Within India, the National Action Plan on Climate Change had no representation from women. Women and Child Development Ministry is still concerned with reproductive health. I mean, come on, man. So, when I started my research on gender decades ago, I went to the ministry and I said, well, I want to meet somebody who works on environment, on climate change. They were like, sorry, but we don't have anyone designated. They still don't have anyone designated working on environment or climate change. They're working on livelihoods, women farmers. So these silos are everywhere. Forget about departments working with each other or ministries working with each other. They're everywhere. And the departments of women and child development are not involved in any state initiative. So you have one of the missions under the NAPCC, the National Action Plan on Climate Change, is on knowledge, right? That's the Earth Ministry. And they have set up climate change cells in different states. The Department of Women and Child Welfare is nowhere. The DST, the Department on Science and Technology, is talking about gender, but it's still somewhere there. In the actual cells that they are operating, there's no initiative to gather data or to, kind of do anything. So, when I started my work on the state climate action plans, nobody was talking about women. The guidelines that were sent by the Ministry of Environment to the states to formulate the state action plans had nothing on gender. So I actually just went and met the guy who had sent those guidelines in the ministry, scientific advisor. And I said, where are the women? They're the ones who are working with, they're like on the front lines of all your natural resources, right? Jal, Jangal, Zameen. They're like everywhere, right? Where are they? Yeah, okay. But we don't want to send notification, add an addendum or something because, it's not, center doesn't want to burden the states with too many notifications or addendums, and states don't take kindly, for it, which is fine. But what they did do was that they said, okay, give us a, outline as to how gender can be included, and then, we will see what we can do. And which is why when I came up with my first policy brief on it, and in fact, all of them are lying outside, so you can pick up copies when you go out. And then in the next subsequent meeting that they had, where they had to approve the state climate action plans, they said, well, all of you have to come up with some gender component, which is how it got included, as part of the minutes of that meeting. So that was quite interesting. The second point is that my experience of working with SAPCCs threw up 2 or 3 very specific things. One, nobody knew at the state level what climate change really is. मतलब सेंटर में भी नहीं पता था, but सेंटर में ये है कि at least people were going out to international conferences and national conferences and reading English speaking articles on that. So yeah, okay, you had some knowledge about it, but at the state level, the poor guys had no idea what climate change really was, but they were asked to make the SAPCCs, right? So, and then on that, you say also do something on gender. They're like, they don't know anything about gender too. So, how do you kind of equate the two? Which is how I ended up helping them really like hands-on, Himachal, Madhya Pradesh, so it was really like hands-on things. But really they had no idea about it. And, I think what Shyam Saranji said about collective blindness to climate change, there's collective blindness to gender justice or climate justice, right? Nobody really understands what it really means, right? So I think that's something that's really we have to demystify what gender and climate change really is in very concrete terms, starting from the ground level. What does it mean for a woman on the ground? I think that's where, what we need to do. And some of my publications try and do that, at least in the agriculture and related activities. Some in the urban sector also. The other thing that the SAPCC the whole process was driven by the COPs. So, the COP wanted a national action plan by countries on climate change, which is how the NAPCC got together. And then, of course, since all the subjects which deal with climate change, all the sectors, agriculture, water, biodiversity, whatever you have, they're all state subjects, health. So obviously the states had to do something, right? It's the same with the SDGs. So, that's how that's how they did. Last point that I want to make now really is that, and before, I'm not offering solutions now, and I hope I can come back to solutions later, but just pointing out my observations at the moment. The last thing really is in terms of finance, in terms of budgeting. So, neither the National Action Plan on Climate Change nor the SAPCCs really have budgets attached to them. Why? Because the whole structure is that each of the missions, whether it is at the center or the state level, are attached to a nodal ministry. So the nodal ministry's budget is something that will also look at climate resilience. Now, obviously, because there's so little understanding about climate change, right? Dr. Gopinathan spoke about disaster risk reduction and climate change, and wherever I go, I say the problem is that people are always, whether it's policy, practice, or investment, people are only talking about here and now, which is what DRR is all about. The disaster risk reduction is, okay, floods are coming, so we need to do something, let's put an embankment. It's now. But when you're looking at climate change, you have to see what's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years and then prepare for it. That's local resilience. But 20, 30 years is too long. The Planning Commission, now Niti Aayog, but the Planning Commission decided just before this government came into position that, okay, or maybe I think when just this government came into position, that's when they just decided that they're no longer going to be looking at 5 years, but they're going to be now looking at 30 years, right, perspective. But wo kabhi bhi tha hi nahi. There was, you don't look at that. And then to actually base it on climate projections, it's now beginning. Ideally, climate-informed decision-making needs to happen. At least theoretically, governments agree to it. But that's not really happening, right? So in terms of investment, two things. One, it needs to be linked to climate projections. Two, it needs to be linked to the contribution of women workers in that sector. So if you have 85% of your farming work being done by women, that 85% of your resources in the various ministries linked to agriculture and allied activities need to go to women farmers. But right now, for instance, see the laugh, smiling at me. Yeah, we've been saying that for a long time, right? But if you look at the organic agriculture policy, for instance, where they're looking at farmers clusters, they don't have any targets on women farmer clusters. The policy itself says 30% of the farmers groups needs to be small farmers and women. Where are we? So I think this collective blindness is still huge, and some of us have grown hoarse talking about it. But I'm so happy to be here and so hopeful. And like I said, there is a pessimism of the mind, but there's still hope in the heart that we will solve it and we will go forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Aditi. This was very informative. I will come back to you on the solutions, and I'm hoping that this panel will focus a little bit more on the solutions. We've had a pessimistic morning. I think we can have an optimistic afternoon. So I'm actually going to, in a optimistic fashion, move to the only man on the panel, Rohit Magotra. And hopefully in a few months this will change and we will have many more people discussing this issue and a greater gender balance as well. But Rohit, I wanted to talk to you specifically about the city level actions, right, which has been what you have been working on, to understand where a conversation like this could be integrated there. You've worked on heat action plans, but also general city-level climate action planning? Does it have to be specific spot action, you feel, or can it all be integrated, and this where can this gender lens be brought in, or is it already being brought in and you would like to talk about those examples? That would also be great.
Thank you. So I think it's one of the opportunities which I didn't want to miss. So that's why I'm here. So when you look at, the climate, I'll straight come to the agenda in terms of the topic of climate change and the gender. So actually both are very difficult topics, which in terms of, the understanding, So when you explain it to the governments, when you explain it to the policymakers, when you explain it to the common man, it's so difficult actually to, to bring this topic into their attention. So that's the most difficult part of it, which I faced initially when we looked at how to, integrate climate from the, not only from the policy perspective, from the research perspective. So the kind of path which I looked at in my, in my career is to how to, bring them from research to policy and policy to the practice. So, and luckily, these are three important components which have been like, foundation of my career, and mostly for the last 10 years, my work is on climate change and cities. So, yes, so the greatest challenge is that, when you are talking about an evidence-based approach, anyone you're going to, whether you're going to the scientists or the policymakers out of the society, what evidence you have for us, that climate change is happening and it's going to affect us and it is going to affect the gender. The first question which I looked into my research, to bring it in, for the policy and the practice is to that how the, the heat is going to affect the woman. I'm particularly talking about the project on heat action, how we looked at integration of heat resilience in the policies and the practice of the governments of India, particularly in the cities. So we developed these heat action plans for the cities of Rajkot in Gujarat, and Odisha in Bhubaneswar in Odisha, and then further we looked at New Delhi Municipal Corporation in Delhi. The first key issue was that, how do you bring out this story of, that heat is impacting the woman, So I think the first question which has to be addressed when you are talking about any policy is to produce a evidence-based research, which you can take and talk to, Here is my data, here is what people are saying, here is what we are anticipating in terms of scientific reports. So I think that is a key tool. So unless we enable more research questions on this topic, there is hardly going to, there's hardly going to be any sizable impact, and nobody is going to notice you. So I think that's a very important dimension when you're looking at a change from the perspective of climate change and gender. The second issue is that, that when we are talking about the policy makers, they hardly actually, have the understanding of the component. So that's where the key solution to this is to engage with them. The more you engage with them, engagement is very, very important, and that's the only key to your success to, having designing a policy. So the engagement with the policymaker is the key. So, so you take this information, we reached out to them saying that you're talking about, oh, there is, the heat is affecting the laborers who are, the outside, and that's going to affect the livelihood. Those people, what the research bring out, it's the indoor heat, the women who are inside the, the kind of a housing, which is, and they have to stay without the amenities in terms of the water, electricity, access to information, access to health services. They are the ones who are getting affected most, So this was something which was never possible unless, the research would have happened and, this component would have been brought. And once it is, taken to them, you have to like, it's not like touch and go. I have to, keep following up, keep engaging with them on one forum, the other for 3 to 4 years to actually bring this into the, the component in the action plans. So, and the third is in terms of the practice, when we are looking at practice, it's a civil society which has very, very integral role to, all this, to the practice component of it. Unless they are engaged, and that space, what we have observed is reducing, the kind of engagement which civil society has, when actually I would talk about our decade, like not this decade, but decades before this decade. So it was very active and vibrant. They were the ones who are making the difference, and we have leaders, and leadership is particularly from the women. Most of my career I've seen leadership from the women, who are the one who are, taking the steps of action. So it's like whenever it's a practice, I think the engagement with the civil society is very, very critical, and engagement with the leaders, women leaders, that is very critical to make that action happen. So, so broadly, from the climate understanding, like from our experience of first, you're talking about heat action plans, what bring climate component into it. We have to produce an evidence, and B is we have to do into several instruments. How do you bring those bring those conclusions in the forefront? So that is through your tools. You use tools as gender disaggregated data, having participation of the women in your surveys, which has to be equal or more than that. And you have to look at the key inferences which is being drawn. They are also women, and at least the people who are doing it, they have a gender lens. So I think from the methodology perspective, it's very important to have these methodologies, research methodologies, to create more capacities of the researchers and the interested citizens in enabling that action. So from research to practice, there are a lot of components which needs to be strengthened, and that needs a lot of engagement per se, and also commitment. And there are hardly there are some dialogues which are happening on gender. So climate is everywhere, but there is nothing about gender, and that's where I think that is key to the practice. You can have policies, you can talk about your climate action plans and state level action plans. They are on the papers and they will remain the papers. What is the practice has to happen? You have to engage with the civil society. You have to mindful of the women leadership in taking up these issues, who are actually the forefront of the action. The action won't happen. The talks can happen, negotiations will happen, but the action won't happen unless you have a very, very capable engagement with the civil society, providing the tools to the researcher, engaging with the policymaker, hitting their doors, not like once, but like hit them till you are in the room. So our lessons are very, we have been able to make that change possible. We have been able to develop and implement these heat action plans with a focus on the gender. And our success story didn't stop in India. We have taken these lessons, and now we are taking these heat action plans, to integrate into the policies of our two neighboring countries, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, which don't have any, there was no focus or priority on these issues. But once we demonstrated it's possible, they are willing to, walk again, taking these lessons and implementing them. So I think I was just wanting to like point you to three important pillars of any such intervention when you're looking at climate and gender. It's research, policy, and practice. In all these components, you have to have a woman-based engagement, and that's where the action is only possible if you are actually, creating the mechanism for participation of the women for the action. Financing is second, I would say, but action can be very action can happen through the participation, and the participation of the woman will only make that action happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. Research, participation, and action. I'm going to keep that in one box and then go to Mukta and then take both the boxes to Sayli, because I think Mukta's intervention will complement Rohit's. So Mukta, you of course work a lot on urban migration, and climate change impacts urban migration. So could you share some of your reflections from your research, and any positive stories are always welcome.
Okay. So what's interesting about panels like this is that, you see these bios and you think people are doing all these diverse things, and then you end up saying very similar things when you're on the panel, which is also good, because that means we already have consensus to start with. So I'm an urban planner, and I stumbled on working on migration through the lens of working on urban informal settlements, and specifically through the lens of housing, where gender is, I'm an architect too, so a lot of this was very practice and intervention work. And migration is an interesting lens to look at things, because it actually transcends the space, the silos of urban and rural. You cannot understand the urban lived experience of a household without understanding where they're coming from, and people do move back and forth. And when you think about vulnerability or communities that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, you realize that the basket of vulnerable communities is actually very similar. No, we can keep shifting the problem, but the people who are impacted the most are the same vulnerable sets of people, and that's where the intersectional lenses come in. It's not just an academic word. We do find in migration that it's tribal communities, denotified tribals, scheduled castes. These are the people who are moving between very impoverished lives, very discriminated, and I would say not even whole lives in rural communities, looking for opportunities and continuing to deal with extremely stigmatized existences in the urban space also. And they don't necessarily live in the quote-unquote slum, because our policy imagination has been divided into slum and non-slum because of the way we capture statistics. They live on factory floors. They live inside construction sites in half-built buildings. They live, in a half-made basement with women, with children. And what happened during COVID, and we did a lot of work talking to state governments and trying to help them think through a lot of things, was even so-called source states, which send all this labor away, was absolutely astonished at the fact that there were so many women and children and entire families engaged in migration. So again, we've been perpetuating this myth of the single male migrant who keeps coming to the cities, builds our cities. We talk about how they are economic contributors. We don't give them anything in return for their economic contribution. And this sort of goes on and on. And this has prompted sort of a framework which looks at, coming back to the gender aspect, which looks at, there is vulnerability, and in all of the action plans, even the ones that were shared in the concept note, women are noted as vulnerable. They're constantly talked about as victims. But on the other hand is also the agency, where again we switch over and we say that women can be leaders. And I totally agree with you, Rohit, when you say that. But the state puts all of this burden of implementation and of the frontline work on women, who don't even get really remunerated for the work that they do. So we're living in this sort of very strange place, and in this we have another layer of climate added, or climate change or climate action added to everything that's already going on, where the WCD is pushing them for nutrition and maternal health, and the RT framework is pushing them for primary education, and so on and so forth. So to come to the point, I think we need to think about this in a very place-based way and start with communities. While the entire frameworks in climate right now are very top-down, and like Aditi rightly said, sort of driven by this agenda of what India's commitments to the global community are, and that's very important. Maybe we also need to start at the other end and think about what already exists in terms of framework in local communities. In city contexts, what are the statutory frameworks that exist where we can insert climate? So it's great to have a flood plan. It's great to have a heat action plan, because there is a specific, people like Rohit have gone and created a specific fire in the belly for implementers on heat action now, today. But what's the statutory document into which that's going to be embedded so that it's there forever? That's the question, and it comes up again and again. In the work that we've done in the recent few years, we've thought about master plans and development plans, which are actually very powerful statutory documents where you can embed a lot. They are stilted in their imaginations because they think about land use, and that's sort of how they have been conceptualized, but that does not necessarily have to be so. And I would say that the Mumbai City Climate Action Plan and its dovetailing with the language of its development plan demonstrates that, at least at the level of writing a planning or a framework document, the kind of mobilization that went into getting a gender chapter into the Mumbai development plan. I mean, those of you who work in the gender space, I mean, that's really a positive example that we give all the time. And now it's that gender component has found its way into the city's climate action plan. The point I'm trying to make is that mobilization is central to what we are doing, and the legal structure is central to what we are doing. You can mobilize all you want, but if you don't have a legal structure to embed it into, that mobilization will require forever and forever the kind of civil society push that, as Rohit mentioned, we probably don't have the steam for anymore. Which means that if you have a right-based, legal framework, then communities can go and demand those kind of actions. We don't have that from a climate perspective today. So you can build all the action plans you want at the state level, but the community, no matter how sensitized it is, and yes, sensitization is important. I agree, Aditi, we aren't even talking, the language is not there with the communities right now. At CPR, I had the opportunity to be part of a large group that mobilized communities in Delhi ahead of the drafting of the Delhi Master Plan. It was a very collaborative exercise with, over 45, 50 civil society groups. And we got the participation of a very large number of women who actually, were logged into DDA online meetings. And here participation is a mandatory part of the planning process. And we would have women from communities sort of getting into these WebEx meetings, and you can imagine the kind of community mobilization it needed for them to get into a WebEx meeting. WebEx is the most unfriendly platform ever, and ask uncomfortable questions like, हमारे यहाँ नाली नहीं बनी है, 15 साल से आप बोल रहे हो नहीं बनी है, and it would completely unnerve the person sitting there who's sort of thinking of issues at a much higher level, but that's the kind of discomfort you need in the room to start dovetailing all these agendas together. So I'll stop there. I'm basically making a pitch for an extremely localized kind of a framework that moves alongside everything else that we are doing, and that looks at all the legal frameworks that are available to us at the place-based, at the local level, and then sort of looks at strengthening that while we are doing, all the other stuff on climate. I'll stop there. I know it's a very pointed intervention, but I thought it went very well with what Rohit and Aditi said.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so happy that my design is working out. So to take both of these perspectives to Sayli, because as NIUA is a government-mandated research center, your organization is actually quite well placed to consider some of these civil society perspectives and ideas and take it to the decision makers. So could you speak to some of the work that I know you've been doing, some of your plans, and ways in which the voices of the women and the marginalized could be included going forward?
Thank you so much, Priyanka. I would like to use this first response of mine to give an overall view about what are the type of, I think, responses that we are now thinking of. When I say we, I'm talking of not only NIUA, I think the general space that, I work in. And then the next intervention, I think I'll give some specifics if you may. So just giving you a map of where, I'm coming from. Actually, I lead alliances in NIUA and the networks therein. So I'm talking of like a climate alliance, a city climate alliance, which is an alliance of 72 partners working in different spaces. They are academics, they are multilaterals, there are NGOs, all of them working with us in the climate space. There are 126 cities who have worked with us in creating in contributing towards a climate framework, whom we are working with here. And we also have a River City Alliance, which is an alliance of 107 river cities spanning over 92 rivers in India. So that is the span of kind of, players that we are actually dealing with. And let me tell you a very interesting thing that happened. So I've just, I've started working with NIUA just about a year ago. And when we first, started talking to players, whether it is partners or whether it is cities, you ask them, so can you tell us a little bit about climate action? They really don't know what it is. In the real sense of it, that what is climate action? We know roads, we know, all the basics, but what is climate action? We don't know. Now you talk to partners and of course they know climate actions better than cities, but then you say, okay, what about climate action and gender? And we have spoken to groups working in gender for years and they say, how are these two things connected? So then we said, okay, now there is this whole thing that we need to take not only one, but many, many steps back and think about this as a larger canvas. And see, where NIUA is concerned, we have a very clear mandate. We are talking about action in cities. It's very, very clear. We are using actionable research. We are using an evidence-based approach to do this. So we said, okay, number one, we have to de-jargonize to decarbonize. Talk very simple at every level. And I think Kubernein does a great job of doing that. I've spoken to Ambika and Priyanka several times. We have to ask the simplest of questions and also give simplest solutions. So we said, okay, since we are dealing with so many cities, we are talking of 400 odd ULBs, we are talking of all of this, what do they want? They want to know ki karna kya hai bhai. Tell us what we have to do. Now, if we have to do that, then we have to first understand that what are the actionable things and point them out very simply. They do not understand this huge language. They do not understand the people who are going to implement stuff. They don't understand these thick reports. So how do we kind of, start looking at this very simply and giving actionable stuff to them? So so for that, I think what we did is two things. We actually started talking to each other within the organization first, because we did not have a gender, a separate group talking about gender. We have an inclusive center, but we said, okay, let us first, before even talking to partners in cities, let's see internally, where do we stand internally? Do we as different centers, 7-8 centers working within even our organization, supporting the housing ministry, really have that? Do we understand gender and climate in its real sense? So the first step was all of us coming together and thinking about this. And when we looked at that, we said, okay, we'll have to work at several levels. We have to work at the policy level, but that might take more time, because we will look at changes in acts, we would look at changes in policies, changes in the language of all these acts, policies. That takes time. But can we just do like smaller interventions? For example, we just brought out a book on good practices in climate action. This 72 partners of ours working in the climate space actually gave us projects that they are doing and successful projects that they have done on, on ground, and we compiled them. And this is a fantastic book we came up with, which cities have much appreciated. But what we then did is we said, this is not enough. Let us quickly insert a chapter on good practices in climate action, for if you want a gender responsive approach. For the first time, one of our reports in NIUA, actually, it was for the first time that we had anything about mainstreaming gender in climate. So now, whenever cities look at a book, or even now we are going to do this digitally, if they want to access stuff and they look at, good practices, we are ensuring that they don't only look at climate action in isolation, they look at it with gender. So very, very small interventions, but we think that, the lowest hanging fruits we must achieve. So peer-to-peer learning, sharing good practices, I think this is a starting point for this to go ahead. The second thing, I think Mukta also touched on some of this, and Rohit, but I would say that what are the ways in which I would say we bring these partners in cities and all of these players to talk to each other, because I think talking to each other is so crucial to understand where gender fits in. So I think there are 3 C's here. So we call it co-creating policies. We are talking of collaborating on projects, and we are talking of connecting people, connecting communities, connecting cities to each other. Because I think learning from each other is the biggest thing if we want gender and climate to come together and all of these players to talk to each other. So we work on these 3, and I think we also have to change the language. Should we be should we have a climate gender sensitive approach, or should we call it a gender responsive approach? I think we have to move from being sensitive to responsive, because everything we do, why should we be talking about, of course, I mean, we need to, but we have to stop that and say that let's be responsive in our approach. Our policies have to be responsive, not reactive. in many ways, and therefore the transformation can happen. So I think, so one is, of course, Mukta gave a brilliant example. In fact, I had the same one, is spatially responsive. How do we become spatially responsive? I mean, we cannot look away from the fact that we do have master plans. We do have local area plans that are now slowly coming up. So how do we ensure that people, oh, sorry. Okay, people, I mean, women are a part of that. Second is socially responsive plans. So socially responsive is, for example, an earthquake. There is compensation that is given. So how do we ensure that these hazards that are, the compensation that is accounted for, that you look at the informal sector and the women working in the informal sector are a part of these compensations, or skill development and livelihoods as economically responsive policies we do, or data response. So how do we have digital inclusion and data responsive methods in place? So disaggregated data, as someone mentioned here. I think transportation, I can quickly, I'll just wrap up. Two examples, both Kerala and Bhubaneswar, they actually have gender disaggregated data as a part of, recording how women are actually traveling around. Now that is actually feeding into several policies, or traveling in, feeding into how women should be traveling, how, authorities should be planning women travel. And finally, I think I would like to say that we have to think about this more from also policy level, but also what cities want. I mean, that is what an urban policy person would think. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Sayli. Do we have time? No? Okay. Okay, so what we will do, since we've run out of time and we want to interact more with the panel, I'll request all the panelists to stay here. We will quickly
forward. Before I come back to this panel that I know has a lot more to say, I actually wanted to take a couple of questions so that maybe the panel can speak a little bit more focused to the questions that we might have over here. We've heard a lot about the importance of collaboration. So Namla talked a lot about that, about co-creation that Sayli and Rohit and Aditi talked about, and the importance of the bottom-up approach that Mukta also touched about, right? How do we bring all of these ideas to the rest of the country and then to our partners around in the rest of the world as well? So I think that is something that's really important. How do we engage with each other? Of course, we need platforms like the NIUA, but going beyond that, how do we engage with each other? So I have a lot of questions, but I'm also going to open that up before I begin with my questions to see if anyone else has any, and I'll take maybe two. If there's a specific question to the specific panel, then you can address it to them, or if it's general, then I will pick somebody to answer the question. Yes, ma'am.
I had a specific question for Sayli. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. You talked a lot about connecting and collaborating, talking, etc. Are there any sort of concrete examples that you can, give us in terms of something that has been done that has been effective and you think can be emulated elsewhere with modifications or whatever?
Yes, the gentleman at the back.
My name is Rohit Magotra, and I'm a journalist. And hearing the panel, okay, hearing the panel, what I would like to suggest to everybody in this room, because you are all researchers, think tanks, etc., as an example of a very specific impact on women and climate change to pursue, because we have been pursuing it for the last 6 years and we do not have a solution. We have been doing a lot of media reports along the Bay of Bengal coast, on all 4 states, on the differential impact of being forced to drink more saline water on women's health, leading to preeclampsia in pregnant women. And this is something that is being talked about, but there is not enough evidence, not enough studies to be able to take it into policy and practice. Thank you.
Okay, so very specific. Sayli, if you want to answer that question with a specific example, and if you ramble, I will turn off your mic.
I can do that, you can't.
So yeah, I would say from the gender perspective, like I had mentioned, we have started a process of mapping. So we have cities we've put on one side, and organizations that can respond on the other, and of course government organizations. So first is the process of actually doing a baseline kind of a process where we are saying what is the demand, because we earlier someone spoke about the demand side, right? We just keep supplying things. So first, just to understand what is the demand from cities and what are the things that are already happening there. Once we know that, and which we have, I mean, in many cases, like one of the entry points for gender is transport, the biggest entry point that we've seen today. So there are very specific examples of cities like in Bhubaneswar or Kerala, where they actually have, many interventions that they have made to either have women in the workforce, in the transport workforce, or respond to, women in transport, using transport methods. So how do we pick up these examples and initiate peer-to-peer learning, but also build on them, because there are many lessons that come out of them. So in this way, I think from my thing is that we have started mapping this exercise as a first point.
Yeah, that's. I'm just going to come back to you, Sayli, on that. Now, in this mapping exercise, who who are all the partners that are should come together in an ideal situation to ensure that that mapping itself is not lacking?
Right. So I think there are partners who should come up at every level, but more at the bottom level. People, very, very localized and contextualized approaches are very, very important in such a. So I think the local groups, communities, and participative mapping is very, very important. So I think that's my response.
And Mukta, you want to add to that?
No, I just wanted to say that this question of women's safety in cities and mobility is critical, and transport is one part of it. And I think there are organizations who've successfully demonstrated, for example, dark spots in the city and using publicly, publicly sort of crowdsourced data to identify them, taking it back to government to inform something as simple as light, repairs and street lights. And I think that sort of example was tested in Delhi and taken across the country in multiple cities and across the world, across other development countries also. So there's lots of these examples. This is a specific one. Like she said, they just don't get accumulated in a way that a lot more people can see them. And at the lower level of the government system, there's no way for somebody sitting in, say, the National Health Mission in Kerala to talk to someone sitting in the National Health Mission in Andhra Pradesh. So that system is missing. Whenever we've tried to create that kind of convening, we've seen that messages start then moving up, and they may or may not come to fruition, but that opposite of the top down, the bottom up, actually starts to happen. So that's one way of doing it.
So that connects really well then to the question that Joydeep was asking, right? As to how do we communicate what is actually going on? It's not that nothing is happening in India or in other parts of the world. It's just a lot of times that we don't know what's going on, right? And so then, Joydeep, can I ask you to answer that, your own question, as a role of a communicator in that space then? And then, Aditi, I'm going to come back to you after Joydeep as to, from your perspective of working with the state governments, what do you think can be done then to solve this problem?
Well, yes, we can communicate, we can do stories, but we need the evidence. The problem is, when we try to do these stories, we find that district medical records are incomplete. They are not properly segregated. They do not give the cause. You are drinking water that's going increasingly saline, and you are getting your blood pressure going up and up, and it becomes a dangerous thing when you're pregnant. And there is no way that the state-run health system has to record this. So that's why I'm asking everybody in this room to actually study this. Because as journalists, frankly, we work on deadlines of anything between 2 days and max 2 months. I'm saying this is something that will take longer.
Yeah.
You'll have to actually gather the data, even in one state, and then Definitely. These are stories that journalists are waiting to do. If you give us the evidence, that time series data, that in 2010 in Vizag, there were X number of pregnant women with high blood pressure. Today it's 2x, 3x, whatever. And you will find it's 2x at least. I've seen it in Vizag. Then we are definitely going to do those stories.
So more information and segregated information, right? Both by gender, by location, by different ethnic groups. Aditi, before I come to you, Rohit, you wanted to add something here, right?
Yeah, I think what he has mentioned is because I come from a research perspective, and research is very critical when you look at evidence making. What I think here the solution and the problem I'll share both. Initially, when we are looking at a heat, so we found that the heat is something which affects women definitely, and senior citizens, even when we're looking at women too. But the pregnant woman, you know that was nowhere in terms of a policy debate or a action which was required. So I think it starts with the anecdotes in terms of what happened to her. you know More mortalities are happening in summer, of these women. You start looking at data. I think research is definitely something which could have a long run and a short term answer. But even if you look at some dipstick kind of study, so that's where the starting has to be. I remember when we started 5 years back, it was very difficult. So we started with some data. Started linking it with some African countries. We started looking at our own experiences from the field, and then we then took them. uh, Particularly, we brought this topic, to the people who will fund such researches. So when we look at, we inform WHO, in these forums, and then they started looking into what's happening around. And I think it took years, but not so long. In 5 years, you have $5 million being invested just on looking at how heat will impact the woman, especially the pregnant woman. So I think that story has to start today, rather than while we are looking at research. Yes, research is critical when we look at evidence. What we should start now and start reporting.
Yeah, I would say we should have started this yesterday, but if not, then today is always a good day. Aditi, do you want to come in here, especially given all your work with the state governments? What is missing over? I mean, I think we know what is missing, but sometimes it's important to state it pretty plainly.
I think I just want to add before I move on that heat doesn't affect only the pregnant women, but also lactating women. Problem is there aren't too many women who are involved in heat action plans. When you're feeding a kid, you need far more water because it completely dries your mouth and yourself. So in disasters, for instance, the sphere standard says so much water needs to be given per person, and I always used to say, listen, why don't you give more water to lactating women? And they'll, why? Because they need more water. So I think this inclusion of women in formulating simple things is extremely important. And I think to answer the questions here, the difference I've seen in my work has been that the best institution to work with is the Gram Panchayat and the urban local bodies. So some of the work that I did, for instance, with the Red Cross, where we train, the thing is that in panchayats, we already have 33% women. Ab 33% hai, but in hill states, usually that 33% goes up because of the way the numbers work. So you already have a captive audience of women over there, right? So we did very hands-on training with them, looking at how do you protect your natural resources, your your disaster risks, and also look at climate projections. So how do you do all that through very hands-on games way of actually training these people? And when they went back, immediately they had the resources to put this in action. So, for instance, in a hill in Himachal, where they were facing a water crisis, timber forest crisis like fodder, etc., they decided that they would build water harvesting structures in the forest, because they said that it's too dry. There's a lot of forest fires, And if we build a forest, if we build a water harvesting structure over there using the government money, because they can use the government money, then, once we have the water there, we can regenerate the forest. So we will have less of forest fires, plus we will have better agriculture down the slope, and, the birds will come back, and the soil erosion will stop. So what in fact Wangchuk Sak said is really true, that in soil erosion, the first flash flood removes the topsoil. Now once the topsoil goes, then unless, if you build walls, it doesn't matter, because it will erode from under that wall. So you can have a protective wall maybe for a year or two, but in the longer run, you need to have roots which will fix that under soil. So they did all that. And they had the NREGA and the water harvesting programs to do that. So there are several examples where just telling the panchayats, for instance, we got the scientists who are working on climate science, the NICRA program that the Environment Ministry has. So the local scientists, we got them to talk to panchayat men and women on what was going to happen to their particular region due to climate projections. And, it was essentially that rain is going to reduce. This was in Bihar. And so the moment they went back, they said, okay, we need to clean up. That's what the scientist told them. He just shut his very jargonized PowerPoint and just spoke to them in the local language. And, they went back and they used the NREGA to MNREGA now, to see MGNREGA now, to say that, they're going to desilt all their ponds and, do a forest, put, forest plantations around their rivers so that they don't erode. So the thing is that once, these are the people who have the resources, they are the ones who have the development schemes with them. So I think building awareness, educating them is extremely important. One more point that I'd like to make
I'm
is
gonna
just
stop
on
you here
just
1 second.
Okay.
I have a couple of more questions, so maybe we can bring in those questions and then your points maybe answer them. Yes, somebody here wanted to here. Yes.
I think partly a comment based on what you had said, Ambika, is how do you create, when we're talking about mapping and assessing demand from cities, I think part of the caution is in a low capacity country where many decision makers may not even know or think that gender safety security is CCTV camera installation. To a large part, we may restrict the scope of what the demand may be. And therefore, perhaps if there is another way, maybe like Ambika mentioned, who else needs to be at the table to say, these are the basic things that we need to have. For example, gender, age, disaggregated data on mobility. No new money is required. Cities already prepare mobility plans. It simply means that we ensure how the data is collected. It has representation. It acknowledges women and gender minorities' travel behavior. So I feel if we can just be a bit cautious when we use the terms participatory or participative to assess whether that capacity exists.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, very good afternoon. I'm Rahul Banerjee and I'm the Managing Director at Ryerson House. Speaking of gender mobility, focusing on mobility as an enabler for especially women as well as other gender minorities, we do a bit of work, especially focusing on how mobility enables more women participation into the workforce. And a model that we adapt or study is the New Delhi model, especially with some of our partners, GIZ as well as Ola Mobility Institute. So a model already exists. The need is localizing the model. We need to adapt that model and localize the same in terms of cities and states and study how it can be adapted over there. Otherwise, New Delhi model, I don't know how many of you use public transport in New Delhi, but New Delhi has one of the best public transport systems. If we ignore the last mile connectivity, it is not gender friendly at all. I have to walk. It does help me get into shape. But yeah, last mile connectivity is a problem. So,
I mean, what you're saying is right? We've been saying that already. It's the ideas that exist around that we don't always know about. And how do you localize those ideas? Sorry, what was your name? You didn't, yes. Sonal, yes. That was a great question. And I'm going to take one more, and then if the panel would like to address some of these issues being raised here.
Thank
Okay,
you.
yes.
My name is Soma. I'm with the Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which is a women farmers' rights platform across 25 states of the country. I just wanted to make two comments to supplement some of the things that have been said. One is on heat wave. We've tried to take a bottom-up approach on that through transacting the state action plans as a part of our information sharing with women farmers in Rajasthan, and to build their priorities then into the GPDP. And that's something that we are still doing through a leadership development process where women start articulating, they know, they understand, they're practicing climate resilience already. How do you build that into water resistant structures, into housing structures, into demands from the municipality, for instance? So there are several examples of this which we'll be happy to share. The other was about localizing. I totally agree with that. I have a booklet which I'll be happy to share with anyone who's interested, of women's struggles and successes to put their knowledge in place about forest conservation as a strategy for livelihood resilience as well as for climate resilience. And to bring that knowledge to the state. In Chhattisgarh, we are trying, and we've been somewhat successful there, to get some of the adverse orders reversed also. But we find a huge resistance at the structural level from state bodies to bring this information into conversations with the state, to bring women's voices into that. So I think that's something we need to acknowledge, that it's not just the localizing of experience and bringing those voices up, but to also work to sensitize, but beyond sensitize, to compel responsiveness from state agencies to make the climate plan as much a part of the articulation as the gender components in our planning processes. So gender responsive climate response plans should be a budgetary necessity in my view. And I'd like to place that on the table. And just one very quick point, the Millet for Millions campaign is being launched today by the iRADE network. It's happening in Delhi, and I'm very happy to share that with you. I hope there'll be much more knowledge and acknowledgement of women's knowledge related to millets as a climate resilience strategy across the country. Happy to talk about that with anybody who's interested through Maqam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Working in this particular sector is mainly on 5 different issues where climate change is linked with different other issues here. So first is data. When I'm talking about data, frankly speaking, I was trying to get a data on climate change and gender. There is nothing. We talk about, because whenever we are giving a data on climate change, it about the CO2 emissions. So we talk about water, we talk about land, but nowhere we talk about the people here. People who are getting impacted, people who are getting impacted during the disasters. So nowhere there is a data on that. Any type of national data is not available that I have found. Second, when we are talking about any type of policies in natural disaster, relief policies and all those, we talk about gender. Where is the LGBTQ community? Where is the transgenders there? Is the policy ever include about them? And when we are talking about urban and rural, we said that I think that people have mentioned that we have now that there is no, you have mentioned it, there is no boundaries now. When we are talking about that there is no job there, because of drought, because of flood, there is no job there, the women are moving. Families are moving. Where is the policy? Where is the shelter homes for women? We don't talk about the shelter homes of women. We don't talk about the shelter homes of the families. Everybody is moving. When we talk about the transport is not just within the city. We have to talk about the transport, overall transport across the countries, from rural to urban, where the woman moves, where the children moves, where everybody moves. Where they move, we talk about that when even the shelter homes, the children, where they go with the parents. There is no Anganwadi which is connected with them. to provide them the basic services there in the urban for the migrants. So there are many other questions. Then when we prepare a policies like these, any type of programs, when we talk about any type of programs like that, it always linked with assets. Women are not there in the assets. Women are not, most of the women, means now there is joint asset that we are talking about in urban areas, but otherwise, all our relief measures are linked with the assets there. So I think there are so many other issues that we need to talk about. But first, as we said, that we need the evidences and where the evidences are.
We need
And
data collection. Yes, absolutely. On some of your points, I will point you to my excellent team, Namrata, who is doing a lot of data collection on specifically the issues that you have brought up. And I think very soon we'll be able to put out some papers and reports on answering at least some of your questions, if not all of them. But I'm going to come back to the panel now. And Rohit, if you want to go first, and then if you want to address any of the specific questions or comments, or throw some new ideas into the mix.
I think the point is, your point is absolutely right. When you look at the data, maybe we have a very learned kind of a group over here, but if I may ask, is there any framework which look into the integration of, gender sensitivity into the climate action plans? Is there any? Anyone has seen it? Anybody will be able to share it with me? Yeah, gender integration in the climate. How to look at, integration of that.
Yes,
Yeah. There is. All right. So what's that framework is, and where it is, who has done that? All right. No. Probably I'm telling you from experience, because when we are looking at this, it's almost not there actually. It's not there because unless you have a framework, first, the problem needs a diagnosis. You need to diagnose what's the problem. And if we sitting here, I'm with a very informed audience, there are no assessment frameworks when you look at the government's documents or even any government plans, how to integrate it. Even there are not researchers' perspectives on this part of it. But small announcement that we have just developed one framework, how to integrate this into, the climate action plans. So we will just release it. I hopefully by mid of this year, we would publish this, and we are happy to share it.
Yes.
So I just wanted to specifically sort of talk about the capacity question, Sonal. Totally point taken. And I think just from the urban perspective, I think Sayli in morning in Ambassador Sharan's session brought up this point about how cities are really critical in this climate action space. But we also have to acknowledge that we don't have an equivalent of the Gram Panchayat. And Gram Panchayat is not a perfect model, but there's a lot of work being done in Gram Panchayats and a lot of experience on the ground in terms of how to implement things with that structure. But the urban local body or the municipal corporation is not the urban equivalent of the Gram Panchayat. It is far from being that. It does nothing except collect your waste. It has no experience. Therefore, people sitting in the municipal corporation have no experience of the complexity of the issues that we're talking about today. And if we expect cities to respond, then we need to start with that capacity question. This is a political question, I'm well aware. But it's a financial question. It's a lot of difficult things that we can't solve today. But it's important that we acknowledge that right up front, that in as much as the borders are melting, in as much as people are moving between so-called rural and so-called urban areas, in as much as many villages are beginning to look like cities, we do have separate governance frameworks, and one of the frameworks is failing. So we need to start addressing that very fundamental issue, and that demand also has to be built up through our communities and through that mobilization. There is no question of women being even part of that process, because that framework itself is so weak that it doesn't matter who is on the table at this point. They're not being able to really make an impact.
Thank you, Mukta. Before that, Omar, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask a very simple question, which I'm not sure has been addressed in any significant way here. Many years back in another avatar, when these things were possible, I'd commissioned a study on peace and women by women in Pakistani side of Kashmir. And it was very interesting that what we got was from small rural areas. Women were saying we weren't allowed even a capability of managing our household budget, much less. So, what are we going to talk about peace between India and Pakistan or across the LOC? Whereas women in places like Mirpur, where there was a lot more economic activity, were far more actively involved. One thing that we haven't mentioned in a little in the transport section, but we've kind of obscured here, is that India has one of the lowest women's participation rate in labor. We have a huge, I mean, across the board disaster that has been going on for actually 2 decades about creating jobs for men or women, actually. I'm just literally coming back from my hometown of Gorakhpur. It's a disaster area when it comes to employment opportunities. Unless the new green economy creates jobs which are specific, which also allow jobs for women. I mean, it's great to have all of this, all of you here, as well represented as you are, but we're marginal to the larger economic and social challenge of India. So, what I was wondering if any of these, I mean, yes, creating a few jobs in addition in, say, the EV sector or something else is well and good. But we need to think far, far beyond that. We can't have 80% of our women not having, or at least all of their work not being compensated in some way or the other, and expect them to be able to take part in any discussion. That's just ridiculous. It's just, how's that going to happen? Sorry.
Ma'am, to you? Yes.
After this thing is
Sure, after this, I'm
Because-
sure if he's happy to stay, you can
hope he stays.
ask him a question. But I'm going to come back to Aditi. If there's anything you'd like to comment on finally, I am aware that we are quite a bit over time, and I don't want to stand between all of you and lunch too much longer. And everybody, please feel free to ask our panel and each other and Sonamla more questions over lunch as well. But Aditi, any final comment from you? And then Sayli, I'll come to you.
So I think we've just put too many things on the table.
Too many things.
And, just to go back to my experience of working with state governments, I've realized that even this panchayat that I was talking about, I've done that in many states. You have to work at both levels. You have to work at the community level by mobilizing and, creating these, but you also have to work at the policy level. So, for instance, when we did this in Bihar, we got permission from the panchayat department and the agriculture department to go and train the panchayat women. So, as resource persons, we could get the department's own people to come in and train, and in the process, they were trained in a lot of what the women said. So, that's the way I've been working a lot. So, I have 1 foot in the corridors and 1 foot in the field. And, that's what I've been doing for the last 3 decades. And I feel that's what's really yielded results. And I'll just end by giving you this example, which, Shyam Saranji shared in the morning on the Andhra farmer suicides, right? So he was then the special envoy on climate change to PMO, to the PMO office. And I was working with another organization, and we called him. And so one of the work that we were doing in Andhra was with an organization that works on organic agriculture. So, we were really pushing for not linear agriculture, but circular agriculture. We called him, we told him this is a way to stop farmer suicides. We got him interested enough for him to send a team to Andhra on his own. We didn't even know about it, but to go and see the work and talk to the department there. And that's where he found that actually it's the SHGs which were doing a lot of this change, and which is what gave birth to the NRLM program. So he actually got the person from Andhra to head it over here. So the thing is that you have to work at both levels, and you just do it, and then things take on a momentum of their own. So I have come to know a lot of it when I've seen it, and when I've been told, I said, "Acha, pick it up." Uh, I didn't know about it. It was only on the net when I was surfing and I found that, oh, okay, they had this meeting and now they've told all the states to actually come up with gender guidelines. So it's not that they come back to you. You just set, but you need to know. I think policy advocacy is in its infancy in our civil society setup. And that is what I have tried to really also focus on. So I think my parting shot really would be, we need both the good work on the ground, and we have policy governance structures which we can leverage, but we need to work on it together.
So I think two things. One, I think leadership is very, very important when we are talking of, good examples. Look at the success stories, right? It all goes hand in hand with either good political leadership or good bureaucratic leadership. And once these actors go away, everything fizzles out. So we need to work on this very seriously, whether it is, training officials, mid-level officials. So we have something called a LCCM program, which is Leadership in Climate Change Management, that we've started, where we are training about 3,000, mid-level officials who are actually in implementation, doing the implementation in climate change management. And we have 28 modules that we have created across climate change in such trainings, but we do not have a gender kind of a module. So that's the next step, like the step that we are taking next. And I think one critical question is of funding. While we do have low-hanging fruits that can be achieved at low cost, what happens next? Right? So imagine under the 74th Amendment, only 70% of the duties mandated to cities are actually funded. You can put budgets against it, but you can't at the others. So, I mean, there's a larger question we need to answer here, that where does the money come from? And then if we are talking of this kind of money coming in, which is discussed in diplomatic circles, I think we need to critically bring it down and say, this is how we bring it into gender in climate. So I think very, very important to
Thank you.
that.
Very, very important. And who gets to decide where that money, how it gets spent, also becomes really important. One sentence, Rohit.
yeah,
Only because you're
yeah,
sitting right
yes,
next to me.
thank you. So my experience is, you tell states you need to do to adapt. Okay, where is the money? There's no money. Can you bring it? We'll do it.
So a lot has been said in this last few hours. I want to thank this panel very much. It's been amazing. We've learned a lot from the work that you're doing, and also from the work that everybody else is doing. I mean, our aim here with this discussion was not that only the panel will speak, but other people in the questions, in their ideas also, I think, give our panel members things to think about going forward. Everybody here is doing amazing work in their own space, but I'm going to say, please trouble Sayli a lot more if you need to, because she's working with the NIUA, and they're actually coming up with some really amazing, very collaborative systems. One of them that we are also a part of on climate, and she and her team are really forcing a very bureaucratic organization to make real change happen. And so I think that is one way in which we can do what we have been trying to do for so many years collectively over here in this space. So feel free to trouble her more.
Thank you, Ambika.
And I'm going to hand it over now to Seema. Yes, that's right. Thank you again, everyone, for being very patient with us going over time.
I think perhaps we should allow ma'am to ask the question that you had for Sonamla, so that, and then we can quickly move for lunch. Ma'am, please.
First, let me thank Mr. Wangchuk for your very insightful and thought-provoking talk on your region, Ladakh. Very interesting that you are pursuing an alternative model of education in your school. So we just wanted to give a sense of a broad outline of this model and how you are integrating gender into that.
Generally, what we are trying to do in this education model is to make it more hands-on and experiential, rather than about discussing about things, but doing it. So that's where you saw the school that is built and run by the children, and when they experience what it takes to run a school like a little country, we run it with elections and a government that takes over and runs real things, whether it is animals like cows or gardens that give them food, solar power that powers their school, all of them they take charge of. And we are seeing how other schools could do that, because without reality, if we just theorize everything, then employers have to re-educate them on real things at the cost of their, which then beats the purpose of having schools at all. It's just for literacy. So it's mainly about that and about making it contextual. Education should not be same. I have problems with central boards and central universities. When we are so diverse, so different, it should be decentralized. What will work for Ladakh will never work for hot deserts in Rajasthan. These are cold deserts or rainy Cherrapunji. So we have to have a contextual focus on what we are trying to solve. So in Ladakh, you could have a mountain university that becomes a role model for all the mountains of the world. But what we get is a central university that is just as it is in Jharkhand or Kerala. So thirdly, it should rely on indigenous wisdom and not just aping something from the West. So all these things we are trying to do. And regarding gender in Ladakh, we have a very good balance in the villages. It's only in the power circles when it comes to elected representatives, the atmosphere is such that perhaps women don't even want to go there. And that's why I said we want to change that by having maybe in 5 years women in such large numbers that they'll change the nature of the platform.
If I may just sort of intrude, and I have permission to do so, and please forgive the sort of delay of 2-3 minutes before lunch. I think that I'm deeply anguished, with the discourse today, only because I feel climate change is at hand. We are looking for the largest mass movement in human history to address this in a manner that the planet responded to COVID at the very least. And I don't think there is time to work through the policy measures and the detailing of it, significant and important as it is. I think that the message that we need to get out into the world, I think it is twofold. That it's imminent, it's urgent, it's here. 10 years ago when Paris happened, we were still talking about what would happen in 2050. It is happening here and now. It's happening in the wealthiest nation in the world. And while we have to continue our sort of, efforts to change the structures and what have you, I think what we're really talking about, as we did in COVID, is behavior change. Urgent and immediate. There isn't time. And I think where, the reason why we were so keen to have Sonam Wangchukla here was that this is an example of a real world experience that has delivered results. It is moving far beyond theorizing into a practical manifestation of what people can do. And so we're really looking here at rapid behavior change as we sought during COVID. So it would be wonderful if we could have a dialogue. The next one really looks at how we can nurture and cultivate it in the next 6 months or a year. At the rate that government and bureaucracies and structures and policies unfold in India, as Shyam said, that, you had this conversation in Paris and that many years have gone by and nothing has changed. So I think the question really is, what can we do so that that changes? And the whole paradigm of discourse and action needs to be very urgently and desperately addressed. I just wanted to leave us with that thought for the next conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Magotra. I think in our little way, I think the film that we will be watching post-lunch does that. It talks about what each one of us sitting here in the room needs to do in terms of changing our behavior, and how urgent it is. Thank you for bringing that up, sir. The lunch is being served upstairs in the lawn. I request everyone to carry your name tags for the lunch. And then on your way out, please, after lunch, we've watched the film. If you are leaving, please leave the tags because we'd like to recycle those. So thank you very much. And thank you, Ambika, for the wonderful panel. And thank you to all the panelists and all the comments and questions.